Has the world forgotten Crimea? A conference in the Ukrainian capital welcomes representatives from 44 NATO and EU countries to remind the world of Russia's continuing illegal annexation of the Black Sea Peninsula. Does the international community have the power to reverse it? Or more importantly, the will? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is Crimea. Well, dozens of high-level representatives have gathered in Kiev under the banner "Crimea is Ukraine." Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is convening the summit in the hope, he says, of raising the issue of Crimea off its knees. Widely decried by most of the world as illegal, Russia's annexation of Ukraine 7 years ago has largely fallen off the global agenda. Now, Zelensky hopes to change that and at the same time put pressure on Russian President Vladimir Putin. Here's a look at some of the history leading up to the inaugural summit of the Crimea Platform.
Crimea was annexed in early 2014 after a revolution in Ukraine which brought a pro-Western government to power and removed a pro-Russian president. The territory then held a referendum, largely seen as illegitimate, where 97% voted to join Russia. 100 nations at the UN General Assembly passed a resolution rejecting Russia's annexation of the peninsula, saying it was a breach of international law. The rest abstained, apart from 10 countries which joined Russia in voting against it. Moscow argued it was an act of self-determination by the Crimean people, a majority of whom are ethnically Russian. 15% of the population are Crimean Tatars, a predominantly Muslim Turkic minority group who strongly opposed Moscow's takeover. An estimated 30,000 Tatars have fled Crimea since 2014. Some who stayed have faced a crackdown. Crimea's largest city is Sevastopol. It's home to a major port and naval base located on the Black Sea. Kiev and Moscow are also at odds over the Donbas region, where pro-Russian separatists have been fighting Ukrainian forces since 2014.
Well, the inaugural Crimea Platform summit is being held on the eve of the 30th anniversary of Ukraine's independence from the Soviet Union. But whether Moscow is actually paying attention to either event seems unlikely. Russia is preoccupied this week hosting an annual International Defense Expo, a massive weapons and military technology trade show with 15 nations taking part. Russia is also holding the International Army Games, a kind of combat Olympics with teams from more than 40 nations competing in war maneuvers for medals. Well, speaking at the summit, Ukrainian President Zelensky said his country is an example of how every nation could fall prey to Russia's military ambitions.
Крим перетворився.
With Russian presence on this peninsula, the Crimea, which is long known for leisurely time, is now a military base. The Crimea has turned to a place where basic human rights are regularly violated. The occupation of Crimea brings doubt to the whole international security system in terms of the validity of borders, which means that not a single nation can be sure that it will be a victim of the next occupation of its territory.
So what can this conference really deliver? Well, joining me now to debate that is from the Crimea Platform Summit in Kiev, Olexiy Haran, professor of comparative politics at Kyiv-Mohyla University. In St. Petersburg is political analyst Alexander Titov. He's a lecturer of Russian foreign policy and history at Queen's University, Belfast. And from Amsterdam is political scientist Kees van der Pijl. He's former professor of international relations at the University of Sussex. Thanks all so much for being with us. Kees van der Pijl, let me first get your take on this summit. Is it good to reestablish, to make a statement about where a united EU, Ukraine, and NATO stand regarding Crimea so that Russia understands that the push to return Crimea to Ukraine is still firmly on the agenda?
I think it's very impressive to bring together 44 nations. But if Russia's not present, it's basically a useless gathering. a waste of time and money, I would say. The Crimea became a problem as a result of the Western advance after the collapse of the Soviet Union. That advance, which was in breach of all the agreements with Gorbachev in 1989, reached a critical point in 2008 when the Bush Jr. administration offered NATO membership to Ukraine and Georgia. Actually, Georgia later in the year tried to recapture one of the many areas that had become disputed because, well, we all know that the Soviet Union had 192 nationalities and national groups, and all these had to be divided over 15 new states, and that was bound to get us into all kind of trouble. Now, in 2014, the NATO advance had reached the point where the United States, in breach again of this time European agreement with then President Yanukovych, when the United States proceeded to support a coup d'etat in Kiev. And that was a nationalist coup d'etat, with very prominent participation of actual fascists, of a stripe that you hardly see in Europe any longer. That inevitably led to the breakaway of those areas of Ukraine where which are either historically Russian or very closely oriented to Russia.
Okay.
All specialists had warned against putting pressure on Ukraine in a way that would lead to an explosion of that multinational entity.
Okay. A lot to take in there. Olexiy Haran, I mean, is it a waste of time and money, effectively, if it doesn't involve Russia at this point? Because it's actually breaking, as Kees argues, it's breaking previous agreements that were signed during the Reagan-Gorbachev era. What's your take?
Exactly. So first of all, I would like to thank you and your program for bringing the question of the annexation of Crimea, because what Russia is trying to do right now, they are going to say, oh, it's done. Crimea is Russian, we are not going to discuss it. So it's very important to remind the world what has happened. And actually, I have a question to Mr. van der Pijl. Was the Nazi occupation of the neutral Netherlands in 1940, was it a violation of international law? And can we justify Nazi occupation of neutral Netherlands in 1940? Netherlands is your own country, right? Can you answer the question? Was it justified, Nazi occupation of neutral Netherlands? Okay, so let me remind you that Ukraine was a neutral state in 2014. There was no support of NATO at that time. What happened in 2014 actually? Ukrainians fighting for liberty, they overthrown dictator, they were fighting for democracy. Mr. van der Pijl actually is repeating the pro-Russian thesis of the so-called fascists. Russia is talking about democracy and fascists. Come on, guys. Ukraine is recognized as democracy by all the civilized world. Russia is dictatorship. Everybody knows about that. So, and what happened after that? Russia violated all the agreements. Russia violated Budapest Memorandum when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. And let me remind you that Ukrainian nuclear arsenal was the third one in the world. Chinese, British, and French compiled together, and we gave up nuclear weapons. Okay. Just for the guarantees of territorial integrity. Also, Russia violated Russia-Ukrainian treaty. Okay. So there's no justification to that. And let me remind you that what happened in Crimea was the first annexation in Europe since Stalin and Hitler. Stalin occupied the Baltic states, Hitler occupied the Netherlands, other countries, Poland, and this was the first annexation after World War II. So it's incredible what happened in 2014. Okay. So what is important right now, Crimean summit, again, it's important to draw attention of the international community, that this is not forgotten. And the world will continue sanction against the aggressor, which is Putin's Russia.
Okay. Kees, I'll quickly let you respond to the parallel that Oleksiy was drawing there, if you agree with it at all, before I come to Alexander to comment on these two dramatically different perspectives on the history behind the summit we're seeing now. Go ahead, Kees.
Well, I think a better comparison to what is happening in Crimea, what happened in Ukraine after 2014, is actually the situation in Yugoslavia right after 1989, which led to the breakup of one of the non-aligned states in Europe, and the creation of completely unviable entities like Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo.
Okay.
I'll reserve my judgment on the Dutch history for another occasion.
Fair enough. Then let me bring Alexander in at this point. Like I said, these are two extremely different perspectives engaging the history here. What do you think is actually more accurate?
Well, I mean, I think, you can debate this endlessly, and, everybody has a very well-established narratives, and we've seen they kind of presented here kind of in a nutshell. I mean, that's fine. There's nothing's going to change, repeating this same points from 2014, right? So I think what's more important, I think, is maybe to ask why, Crimea becoming again at the center of the, Ukrainian leadership's attention again, right? So, and I think, you have two, I mean, obviously for Ukraine will never recognize the loss of territory, and they have a broad support of international community for that, and, various other forms. But I think Crimea has been in the sort of shadow of the Donbas conflict throughout this period, right? So now they're trying to bring it back to the fore without really having solved the Donbas problem, right? The Donbas is much more acute problem because there's an actual fighting going on there. There is a conflict line with shots being fired and so forth. And when Zelensky was being elected, he put Donbas at the forefront of his election program, right? That he will solve the problem. Obviously there's been no movement on that, and we can blame Russia, you can blame Ukraine, whatever, but it's basically been exactly where it's was before Zelensky got elected. Okay. So now he's kind of trying to shift the problem to Crimea, which I think everybody in the hearts of hearts know. You can bring attention back, but you're not going to solve it either. So I think that's kind of a broader context, which is probably more important than just restating the kind of narrative points, which we all know by heart by now.
Fair enough. So let's move on to that then with Oleksiy. I mean, this is kind of there's a strategy behind trying to remind the world about Crimea, according to Oleksiy, or Alexander. Oleksiy, do you worry that the real impetus here with this conference and trying to get the world's attention back to Ukraine could be lost under arguments like what Alexander was making, and that it's almost just another PR strategy at work here?
Look, the territory is occupied. People in Crimea are persecuted. They are in dictatorship right now. Now there are more than 100 Crimeans who are tortured in Russian prisons. Most of them are Crimean Tatars. And I would like to remind you that in 1944, all the Crimean Tatars were deported from Crimea, and they were prohibited to come back to Crimea until 1990. So what's happening right now, the leaders of Crimean Tatars, they are not allowed to come back to Crimea. Russia is restricting them. So I'm asking the world, should we forget about it, or should we remind the people about what's going on in Crimea? People who are suffered from the lack of freedom, people who are persecuted. Moreover, Russia is transforming Crimea in its military base. Russia is violating the freedom of navigation from Black Sea to the Azov Sea. So Russia is violating all the treaties. Okay. So, and I think it's important that people, the civilized countries of the world are in solidarity with Ukraine, and they agreed to keep the sanctions on Crimea and, if necessary, to increase them. Definitely, it's a very long road. We are pragmatists and we understand that. But let me also come back to two different perspectives.
Okay, wait, before you go too far.
I'm sorry, I'm the only guy from Ukraine. Two are not from Ukraine.
Right, I need to have certain points addressed, and I'm going to come right back to you.
I will tell one sentence. He is representing the point of view of only one country, which is Mr. Putin. What I'm saying is supported by the civilized world. Thank you.
Understood. Okay, but first, Kees, I want you to pick up on the initial point that Olexiy was addressing and the criticism that the people indigenous to Crimea, the Tatars themselves, have been expelled, dispersed. They've been artificially replaced with a Russian ethnic majority who was then allowed to vote Crimea out of Ukraine at the Tatars' peril. There's a lot of feelings that needs to be addressed specifically, and I want to know how you defend Russia's case there.
Well, I'm not here to defend Russia's case at all. I'm an international relations scholar, and basically I look at this whole situation with a fairly neutral view. I mean, of course, the Tatars were originally masters of Crimea. That goes back to the 18th century when they were when Crimea was conquered by Catherine the Great and made part of a Russian empire.
So is it okay what is happening to them now?
To the Crimean Tatars?
Yes.
Well, I've always been in favor of the application of socialist nationality policy, which I think is one of the great legacies of an otherwise failed Soviet state socialist model. And that idea was that every nationality had its innate rights laid down in the passport and so on and so forth. I mean, we can't keep going over the longer history of Crimea. You know, the fact that it was a part of the Russian Empire when the revolution happened, that Khrushchev, in a drunken mood, assigned Crimea to Ukraine. Of course, not expecting, as I didn't, that the Soviet Union would ever disintegrate, and so on and so forth.
I think the problem is, though, with the Tatars, is the issue is what's happening actually now, that they continue to be marginalized, even persecuted.
I think there are different factions of Tatars, and please look at the treatment of Tatars when Ukraine was independent. You know, we shouldn't idealize that. Although I know that from the perspective of Turkey, the Tatars are, of course, closer to their heart than any other group of inhabitants of Crimea.
Okay.
But this is not a useful thing, not a useful perspective. You have to look at the end of the Cold War, the forward pressure of NATO, which, by the way, has 17 times the defense outlays of Russia. So we're not talking about Russian pressure to the West. It's exactly the opposite.
Right. Let me bring Alexander.
Crimea as a result. Yeah.
Sorry, I'd like to get Alexander back in because, as you said at the very beginning, that this is not going to get resolved, and especially when we're hearing such different, perspectives of what the real issues are at play here and the history, of course, behind it. Some might come to agree with you that this might not lead to a good resolution. I think one of the other issues then that is at risk here is that with talk, as Olexiy was saying, of more sanctions, feeling that would be appropriate against Russia for what's happening in Crimea and continues to happen. Is there a risk that further provoking Russia, provoking the bear, as some would say, could lead to even more dangerous fallout?
Well, I mean, if you think about specifically Crimea, I think there were a series of sanctions introduced against Russia specifically with relations to Crimea. They were not the hardest sanctions introduced against Russia by the EU or the United States. Those were the sanctions related to its involvement in the conflict over the Donbas. So the issue here is that Russia is basically, is secure in its possession of the peninsula. Sanctions not going to change his mind, obviously, even if even harsher sanctions didn't change his mind over much less important territory such as Donbas for it, right? So, but you're right, in the broader context, and and we've seen it that Merkel was in Moscow last week. She went to Kiev. She didn't stay for the summit. They all basically understand. Yes, I mean, for Ukrainians, it's important to bring attention to the issue of Crimea. Although I would imagine that Donbas is much more kind of problematic. I mean, important to resolve than Crimea right now. But anyway, yeah, I mean, I think everybody knows that there are limits to sanctions. Crimea is not the most important element for it. But I mean, if there were further fallout between Russia and the West, then the Crimea can certainly be used as a useful pretext or excuse to impose more sanctions. But it's not going to change things on the ground.
Alexander, though, is there potentially an element here of neighboring countries and allies of Ukraine kind of paying some lip service to the issue of Crimea right now, knowing that they won't be able to effectively do very much about it, especially with the Nord Stream 2 pipeline still set to go forward? I mean, Ukraine actually told Germany to stop building it because it leaves Europe at the mercy of Russian gas supplies. He described it as President Zelensky described it as a geopolitical weapon of the Kremlin, which is dangerous for all of Europe.
Yeah, I mean, again, the issue here is that there's more. I mean, of course, Ukraine has its own perspective, and the West has been largely supportive of Ukraine, but it can't, or it's not going to operate just from the point of view of Kiev, right? It's very sympathetic to it, but it's not the only point of view. So as the Nord Stream have shown, that Germany prioritizes direct and security of supplies directly from Russia than having the same gas flowing via Ukraine and so forth.
Okay.
But it's not abandoning Ukraine. But I don't think anybody in Ukraine think that the talking about Crimea will change anything. But they just want to bring it back to the attention. And for Zelensky, it's a more convenient point of reference, Crimea, rather than Donbas. Whereas Donbas, he still needs to do something. He can't do something with Crimea. It's just pure.
Okay. Olexiy, I'd like to know what you make of what you've just heard there. I mean, especially you brought up, sanctions. You'd like to see more punitive action taken against Russia for what's happened in Crimea. But knowing what's at stake here economically, the fact that Alexander was outlining why this will just more or less be, I don't want to characterize it as a talk shop, but a way to bring attention to the issue without really being able to do much about it. What are your fears then going forward? If the Nord Stream 2 pipeline also continues to be built and Europe becomes more economically dependent, in a sense, on Russian gas, where do you see all of this going?
Oh, that's the problem, Nord Stream 2. But again, I'm afraid this is another topic we should discuss during other day. What we are talking right now about Crimea, should we raise the issue or not? Look, during the Soviet Union, when Soviet Union existed, the West, the international community, was defending human rights movement in the USSR. Was it necessary to defend human rights movement in the USSR? I have this question to my colleagues, because at some time it looked like, no, it's useless. But at the end of the day, it appeared that the Soviet Union lost. And it was really important to defend those who are defending human rights, even under totalitarian regime as it was in the Soviet Union. And, I lived under communism. Mr. van der Pijl didn't live under communists. He doesn't understand what does it mean. I know what is KGB. KGB is still there in Russia. It's now in Crimea. So I think it's really important to remind people of what's going on in Crimea, to increase the level of interference from international organizations, Amnesty International, Reporters Without Borders, other organizations. You know, not only Crimean Tatars are persecuted, not only Ukrainians are persecuted in Crimea. Jehovah's Witnesses, they are also persecuted, and so on and so forth. There is church religious discrimination in Crimea. So whatever we are thinking about the future, how long will it take, you know, to return Crimea? We are realists. We understand that it would be a long road. But at this point, we need to do everything possible to defend people in Crimea who are now living in dictatorship. And let's be clear about that. Ukraine is democracy with all its problems. Russia is dictatorship.
Okay, Oleksiy, I will have to give you the final word for this edition of the Newsmakers because we are completely out of time. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists sincerely so much for being with us, our viewers as well. Thank you for watching. You know, you can follow us on Twitter at @the_Newsmakers and let us know what you think. We'd really like to hear your comments, and we'll see you next time.